even if it came at a high cost, showed that they now saw this area as at least a potential part of civilization, not to be abandoned. Reinforcing this, the Qing also began changing place names in Xinjiang during the 1830s, substituting names recalling past Chinese outposts for the names that had been in place before that, which were transliterations into Chinese of names in local languages. So they were essentially trying to make this place look familiar and look as if it was Chinese, something they had not tried to do before. Now, many influences lay behind this reversal. For one, these Han intellectuals appeared to be following a linguistic shift that had begun in Qing state documents, that of explicitly equating the dynasty's entire territory with Zhongguo, that term literally meaning central country, or as in Western, somewhat orientalizing translations, Middle Kingdom, is the term that today is translated simply as China.
Professor Kenneth Pomeranz is a professor of modern Chinese literature at the University of Chicago. His work focuses mostly on China, but he is also very interested in, and he has highly invested in, Professor and world history. His publications include The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and America of the World Economy, which was published in 2000. The book won the John K. Fairbank Prize from the American Forum Network and shared the World History Association Book Prize. Another important book of his is The Making of the Kingdom, State, Society, and Economy in Inland China, 1853 to 1947, which was published in 1993. And that book also won the Fairbank Book Prize. Professor Pomeranz was one of the founding editors of the Journal of Global History. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has received many publishers from multiple sources, including the William Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, American Council of the Learned Society, the Institute for Advanced Studies, the National Endowment for Humanities, among many others.
It is striking that roughly 1/4 of humanity has lived in one polity for a sizable portion of the last 2,000 years and for almost all of the last 700 years. Moreover, of the 6 huge states that cover 40% of the Earth's landmass today, Russia, Canada, China, the United States, Brazil, and Australia, 5 benefited quite substantially from what Alfred Crosby has called ecological imperialism, in which early modern settlers brought diseases to which native people had no resistance, and also brought plants and animals that had no enemies in their new homes, greatly facilitating both conquest and colonization. Chinese expansion, with minor exceptions, lacked those supports, and so is in many ways even more striking. The People's Republic can also be seen as successor to one of several large multi-ethnic empires that flourished between roughly 1400 and 1918. The others, Mughal, Ottoman, Romanov, Habsburg, etc., all fractured into multiple states, as did Europe's overseas empires. But China today includes almost all of the Qing realm, despite a century of incursions by stronger powers. This ongoing creation and recreation of political unity matters for both scholarly and other issues. My focus today is on how Chinese elites came to think of various areas conquered by the Qing dynasty between 1683 and 1759, so anything that's not labeled Ming Empire on this map, areas that rarely, or in some cases had never previously been ruled by China. And so the question is, how did people come to think of these as domestic, both in the modern sense of domestic, meaning not foreign policy, that is, part of the realm's bounded internal territory, whether that realm was the Qing, or the republic that succeeded the Qing, or the People's Republic that succeeded the Republic in 1949. But it also nods towards another meaning of domestic, referring to matters of the household. In this case, the process of coming to think of various frontiers as places where it was possible for normative good subjects, and in the 20th century, good citizens, to have proper families, occupations, relations to ancestors, and so on. In a classic 1968 essay called The Chinese World Order, John Fairbank emphasized sharp differences between a modern state, geographically limited, but absolutely sovereign within those borders, and a Chinese idea of universal empire, which Fairbank believed had endured from ancient times until Western impact in the 19th century. An empire centered on a son of heaven who, if properly virtuous, would be acknowledged by all under heaven. Now, that did not necessarily mean that such an empire would rule everyone directly. Outer regions might have their own rulers and offer tribute, rather than live under bureaucrats from the center. And actual rulers were bound to fall short of perfection anyway, leaving room for realpolitik. But in theory, the realm was an all-encompassing set of concentric circles, from the emperor at the very center to the most civilized subjects to less and less and less civilized subjects as you moved further out, and theory mattered. And in fact, Fairbank insisted, continued to matter even after foreign powers began quite forcefully insisting on very different Westphalian ideas. 40 years after Fairbank, Alexander Woodside considered how well this interpretation had held up and what that might imply for what was by then a booming field of borderland studies. He noted that the all under heaven framework defined the center of the polity quite precisely as the place from which civilization and its blessings radiated outwards, but didn't much bother defining the borders. Remote frontiers, in this view, contributed nothing, except that the mere fact that they submitted confirmed the center's greatness. China's former borderlands are full of places with names including the characters for peace and pacification, ironically, especially in places where peace was particularly elusive. In Guizhou province, where resistance was particularly intense, perhaps 1/4 of all 20th century place names have the character for peace or pacification in them. But what one doesn't find are names suggestive of new or redemptive possibilities on the frontier exceeding what was possible in the core. No New South Wales, New Orleans, New York, or Bethlehem for that matter. Nor did borders need to be clearly marked in this view, because the true object of rule was people, not territory. And just as Fairbank had argued, the sign of success was that faraway people, in the Chinese phrase, turned towards civilization in various partly symbolic ways, not that they necessarily paid taxes to the center or were on the census rolls. They needed to acknowledge Beijing's superiority, but not necessarily its Westphalian-style sovereignty. Furthermore, Chinese political thought often stressed the unhappy insight that the frontier might not even yield the neutral outcome of adding nothing to civilization. Instead, frontiers were often places where imperfect rulers might use force to achieve submission, resulting in expenditures and hostilities that undermined the whole polity. So the frontier was not, in this view, capable of adding much, and it was capable of being a morass that caused very serious problems. In a similar vein, Woodside argued that though Chinese rulers were certainly aware of frontier resources, of mines, salt deposits, etc., that they wanted to exploit, they did not see these places as areas to be integrated into an expanded, wealth-enhancing division of labor. And I would add, even when frontier resources were coveted, the argument made for annexing them was often that they were currently being purchased from others, which cost too much and/or strengthened the empire's enemies. Seizing them was thus conceived as being about stopping a drain, not generating growth. In short, the frontier was seen less as a zone of opportunity than as a source of problems to be managed. Even in the most optimistic, idealist discourse, it was a place that could be transformed for its own benefit, bringing it the benefits of civilization, but not as a place that was particularly of benefit to those already civilized. Now, this is all too simple, as Woodside, among others, knew. Chinese states did draw sharply defined borders when they needed to. Certainly the Qing did so when dividing sparsely populated areas with Russia in treaties in 1689 and 1727. In these negotiations, moreover, the Qing quickly dropped the pretense that the Son of Heaven occupied a fundamentally different, superior plane from that of the Tsar, and they negotiated as state to state with an understanding of equality. More fundamentally, I would emphasize the idea that all under heaven should be one empire, uniting the only true civilization, had been offset from the very early imperial period by the idea that there were people and places for whom civilization wasn't in the cards. In particular, places unsuited for agriculture were considered unsuited for civilization. Where you couldn't farm, people would be migratory, wouldn't have property, wouldn't tend ancestral graves, and so on. And such people could never be fully trusted. This line of thought appears occasionally, even in pre-imperial texts, and really took form in Sima Qian's Shiji, Historical Records, which was compiled around 90 BCE, near the height of Han Dynasty's success against their nomadic enemies. That text became a model for most subsequent Chinese history writing and played a major role in making eternal a sharp steppe versus sown opposition that was in fact of fairly recent vintage. Bangu, a slightly later historian, provided the following highly influential formulation. Barbarians have a human face and beast's heart. They follow their herds across the grassland and hunt for a living. They are separated from us by mountains and gorges and barred by the desert. Thereby, heaven and earth sever the internal from the external. Therefore, the sage kings treated them as beasts and birds, did not make treaties with them, and were not engaged in offensive expeditions. If you make a treaty with them, they spend the gifts and then deceive you. If you attack them, then the army is exhausted and you induce banditry. This is not terribly accurate history, but it was extraordinarily persuasive ideology. Other scholars across the centuries repeatedly argued that the environments in which northern border tribes in particular lived determined their occupations, and that those occupations made them unfit for civilizing. Similar arguments were made, though less forcefully, about people living to the south. Those areas were, after all, well-watered and thus potentially arable, so literati and officials differed more on the prospects for civilizing those areas. Through much of imperial history, maps often showed fairly clear borders in the north, but rarely in the south. So here are two quick examples. This is one from the Song Dynasty, and you can see in the north, you have a fairly sharp boundary delineated, and in the south, it just kind of gradually bleeds out. This is a slightly later map, not one made by a state entity, but by a Buddhist monastery, but you see the same phenomenon. But given the altitude, aridity, and so on of many of the areas around China, especially to the north, and this is one of my favorite simple maps. It just shows you an awful lot about China really quickly, particularly that the notion that so many people seem to have that it's one great flat plain. Folks. This is a little harder to read, but this is a precipitation map. And let's see if I can get my cursor here. So this is roughly 20 inches of rain a year. Anything under this, it's quite hard to have really reliable rain-fed agriculture. This one here is 10 inches. Under that, it's essentially impossible to have reliable rain-fed agriculture. So if you have maps that look like these two that I've just shown you, and you believe that only agrarian societies are good candidates for civilization, this clearly limits how much adjacent territory one should think of incorporating. And in fact, these limits were arguably reached with the absorption of Manchuria on the one hand and Taiwan on the other in the 1600s. 18th century expansion, focused on Central Asia, was at first quite different. Essentially a matter of forward defense against people conventionally understood, at least by the Han Chinese majority, as being forever alien. So the state's failure to precisely define some of its frontiers or make plans to exploit them wasn't only due to a moralistic view of the world. There were also materialist reasons for thinking that all one could hope for was that the expanded Qing frontier would not cost too much. Until the late 1980s, most historiography, both in China and in the West, held that this view that I've been outlining did not really begin to change until the very end of the 19th century, when it succumbed to a combination of foreign pressures, Western ideas of formally equal sovereignty and firm borders, and increased interest in populating frontier zones in order not to lose them. More recent research has shown that this heightened interest was also tied to emerging concerns about securing mineral resources for military and industrial needs, which made some of the frontiers finally seem like lands of opportunity. In the 1890s, for instance, people began writing about gold in Qinghai and Tibet as a major source of wealth. In fact, it became, at least for a while, a cliche to talk about Qinghai in particular as a California waiting for us. Having lived in California for many years, I don't really see the resemblance, but that's another matter. What's striking, though, is that people had known about this gold for centuries, and yet it had not previously triggered the idea that this frontier was a land of opportunity. Clearly, there's a new attitude towards certain kinds of wealth and towards minerals in particular. By the 1920s, some people imagined Mongolia accommodating 80 million Chinese. Sun Yat-sen, somewhat more realistically, proposed 10 million settlers. Nor would I would note, were such fantasies a particularly Chinese disorder. An English strategist writing in 1932 estimated that southern Xinjiang alone could comfortably accommodate 160 million new residents. It has about 10 million people today. So this story of a heightened awareness after roughly 1895 of imperial rivals and the value of mineral resources certainly has merit, but I think it misses a crucial prelude and thereby makes the turn to a nationalistic frontier policy seem both more sudden and more dependent on external stimuli than I think it really was. My story, by contrast, is a gradual one, in which the 18th and early 19th century witnessed changes independent of Western impact, which made possible the seemingly radical shifts of the post-1895 era. But first, let me flesh out a bit more the baseline from which those changes occurred, tracing some ideas in non-state documents which reflect thinking about migration complementary to the ideas that we've already seen expressed in state policies and documents. One of the best established truisms about traditional Chinese notions of ethnicity and nationality is that they were culturalist rather than biological or racial. In other words, somebody who followed Chinese ways of living could be considered Chinese regardless of skin color or eye folds. This viewpoint echoes through the classics with stories of ancient sage kings from barbarian lands, etc. And it fits perfectly with thinking that frontier peoples could be transformed and made indistinguishable from those of the Central Plain. Given those views, one would think there would be no shame in admitting that one had ancestors who had been, quote, uncivilized. In fact, it might reflect all the more honor on them that they had turned towards civilization from such unpromising origins. And we know that a great many leading families did have such origins. Moreover, lots and lots of the Han people, Han being the overwhelmingly dominant ethnicity today, and if you look, for instance, at the people in South China who are classified today as Han, we know large numbers of them are actually assimilated non-Han peoples. And there are many, many ways we can trace this, but one of the most striking today is actually from DNA evidence. I don't want to go into the details of this too much, but basically what this chart shows, what this map shows you, is that the people north of the Yellow River who are classified as Han today actually have more in common genetically with the people north of the Yellow River who are not called Han than they do with the people south of the Yellow River who are called Han. And those people south of the Yellow River, in turn, have more in common with the so-called non-Han of the south than they do with their alleged fellow Han of the north. So we know that there was a tremendous amount of passing, and in fact passing in both directions, because sometimes it was advantageous to be non-Han. But nowhere will you find a genealogy that admits such a thing, at least for male ancestors. Without exception, the socially ambitious families of Central and South China have claimed descent from men, usually high-ranking ones, who are said to have fled either the North or the Middle Yangtze region during some episode of barbarian conquest or civil strife. Not only the origin, but the occasion of flight is significant here. The ancestors are not represented as having gone to the frontier in search of something that the center never provided. So, let's say, social fluidity. But instead as people who went to the frontier to await the return of the civilization that the center normally embodied, but that it temporarily did not due to the invasion or the civil strife. Again, the frontier is portrayed not as a place of new possibilities, either for the polity or for individuals. Now, of course, this hadn't stopped many people from going to frontiers, especially in the Qing, and often going precisely in search of personal advancement. Nonetheless, it does give us some further sense of the intellectual distance that needed to be traveled before the turn of the century burst of enthusiasm for defending borderlands and enriching the nation by promoting mass settlement of frontiers could take hold. Not to mention a variety of social Darwinist ideas that became popular in the 20th century about how one would actually improve the Chinese people in the process of moving into these territories. Something I'll get back to at the very end of my talk. But underneath all of this, things were changing. Part of the story behind that change was both straightforward and deeply ironic. The Manchu rulers of the Qing made the northwest frontier seem much tamer by winning China's, in quotes, biggest victories there in a millennium, subduing once threatening Mongols through an inventive combination of Chinese and Central Asian military and political techniques. To this one must add the fortuitous but hugely important fact of Russia's simultaneous expansion eastward. The Qing made treaties with this rival, adopting European conventions such as fixed borders and treaties among formal equals quite straightforwardly when it served their purposes. And once borders were fixed, Russia's assertion of sovereignty on its side meant that steppe peoples could not retreat indefinitely from Qing forces. The consequence was that decisive victory became possible at last and at an affordable price. If you think back to that long quotation I gave you from Bangu, in which she says, if you engage with them, the army becomes exhausted and ultimately turns to banditry. The point there was that as long as the steppe was unpoliced on the other side, these people could retreat, and every mile you advanced into the steppe with an infantry army was unbelievably expensive because you had to haul everything out there. But once the Russians are coming from the other side, that's no longer possible, and the Qing become major beneficiaries of this closing of that particular frontier. Post-conquest, the Northwest changed in various ways that would later make it easier to absorb. The arrival of Han civilians, though in much smaller numbers than in the more agriculturally friendly Southwest, was obviously important. Equally important, elites within China proper gradually began to think of the far Northwest as part of their empire, something that they did not at first think of it. When fighting first ended in 1759, many Han officials and intellectuals recommended withdrawing from most of the newly conquered buffer zone. Abundant precedent suggested that trying to garrison this area, much less rule it directly, would simply be too expensive. And when the Qing emperor solicited suggestions on how to handle the frontier, he was rather surprised to get a lot of people writing in and saying, okay, we won, now let's get out. We've taught these people a lesson, but we don't want to be there. But interestingly, after some serious unrest in Xinjiang in the 1820s had been suppressed, statecraft-oriented Han Chinese intellectuals, who had become in the intervening decades far more involved in studying and sometimes governing frontier regions than they had been at first, uniformly rejected retreat. On the contrary, several of them, most prominently a man named Geng Zejun, in an essay published in 1827 that we'll get back to in a couple minutes, argued that Xinjiang needed a larger permanent garrison. And this, in turn, he said, required bypassing the region's non-Han indigenous elites, instituting direct rule down to the local level, encouraging immigration, and relying on economic expansion fueled by those immigrants to generate the needed revenue. In other words, what he was advocating was the exact opposite of the old idea that you wanted to engage with the frontier as much as you needed to for security, but not much more because it was basically a hopeless morass, and particularly a hopeless place in which to try to live a Han-style, quote, civilized life. Now, the Qing were far too weak at this point to thoroughly implement the aggressive policy that Geng called for, but they did begin promoting immigration to the Northwest after 1831, a sharp turnaround from previous policy. And perhaps as important as the actual policy changes is that Han Chinese support for a much stronger presence in Xinjiang, even if it came at a high cost, showed that they now saw this area as at least a potential part of civilization, not to be abandoned. Reinforcing this, the Qing also began changing place names in Xinjiang during the 1830s, substituting names recalling past Chinese outposts for the names that had been in place before that, which were transliterations into Chinese of names in local languages. So they were essentially trying to make this place look familiar and look as if it was Chinese, something they had not tried to do before. Now, many influences lay behind this reversal. For one, these Han intellectuals appeared to be following a linguistic shift that had begun in Qing state documents, that of explicitly equating the dynasty's entire territory with Zhongguo, that term literally meaning central country, or as in Western, somewhat orientalizing translations, Middle Kingdom, is the term that today is translated simply as China. Geng Zejun, for instance, began the essay on Xinjiang that I mentioned in a striking, though somewhat illogical fashion. He begins by saying, "There are many countries under heaven, but none is as large as our great Qing." A formulation that certainly sounds much more like a modern notion of inherently plural territorial states than any notion of even potentially universal empire. And he then continues, "The country of the great Qing is that which has been called Zhongguo since the time of the mythical ancient sage king Yao. The territory it occupies in the east and south is bordered by the sea. In the north and west, it does not reach the sea, but written agreements can be cited, as there are no seas giving it shape to the north and west. Today, its farthest boundaries in the west reach to Aiwugan and stop there. In the north, its farthest border reaches to the government post at Wulianghai and stops there." Now, the written agreements in question are clearly the 1689 and 1727 treaties with Russia, and Geng refers soon after this passage to the Qing having expanded beyond the territory held by other dynasties. So he is obviously aware that this had not been Chinese territory ever since ancient times. In nonetheless equating all of Qing territory to the setting of China's classical past, he essentially sacralized his own era's borderlands, making them something that any literatus, as an inheritor and transmitter of ancient culture, should want to keep within China. Gong's move resembles many other creations of deep national pasts by modern nationalists, often, in fact, at roughly this time in the 19th century, despite the absence of any trace of Western influence on him. For Han literati, excuse me, to equate all of Qing territory with an ancient Zhongguo was important, but not original, or not wholly original at least. Qing rulers seem to have initiated it themselves, mostly in diplomatic documents, but sometimes in other official texts as well. It was not the most common formulation, but it occurred often enough to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become frequent assertions that all this territory lay within China, even after the Qing themselves were gone. But if the whole Qing realm was Zhongguo, then Zhongguo seemed to have parts not suitable for direct rule and civilization. Indeed, not even all of the 18 provinces inherited from the Ming were. Efforts in the 1720s and 1730s to bring more of Yunnan and Guizhou under direct rule, with regular officials replacing tributary chieftains, had led to bloody insurrections. The next 60-plus years then saw a retreat to reliance on local rulers in much of that region, even while those local rulers were very gradually incorporated into more formal bureaucratic relations, and even as their sons were increasingly educated in Chinese classics. This was often accompanied by attempts to keep immigrants out of the chieftains' areas. Excuse me. There was even less enthusiasm for civilizing most northern borderlands. There were many reasons for this, but the most important is that they were thought to be unsuited for farming. And without farming, there was little chance of either sinifying the natives or attracting the right kinds of Chinese immigrants. Other resources, especially mines, were sometimes coveted, but that didn't necessarily require direct rule. Indeed, where the Qing saw only non-agricultural resources, they often preferred indirect rule, with chieftains providing the desired goods as tribute. While various officials complained about this, claiming that indigenous miners were less efficient than Chinese would be, the court generally considered such inefficiency an acceptable price to pay for avoiding the turbulence that they were sure would result from an influx of Chinese miners or from introducing direct rule and wage labor to people thought to be unready for them. Now, many societies, of course, valorized farming over other kinds of manual labor. China is by no means unique in this. But China may have done so especially strongly. Cosmologically, agriculture, like sacrifice, was a way in which people joined together heaven and earth, as moral individuals were supposed to do. Miners, on the other hand, were said to, quote, gouge the veins of the earth. More practically, non-agricultural kinds of work were considered unlikely to promote stable residence or give men enough income to form families. And indeed, mining, logging, and so forth attracted very disproportionate numbers of young single men. For complicated reasons that I'd be happy to go into in questions, China had a very small proletariat, a very small number of wage workers, despite being a highly commercialized society. Circa 1800, probably less than 15% of workers got most of their income from wages. Moreover, agricultural laborers earned much less than even most tenant farmers, perhaps a third as much on average, not to mention earning even less compared to people who actually owned their land. Since employers of non-agricultural, unskilled labor had no need to pay much more than the farm wage, right? If the farm wage is a third of a tenant's income, you just want to pay a third of a tenant's income plus a couple cents. And that's enough to lure somebody whose only other option is landless labor to go do their landless labor for you doing something other than farming. Consequently, people like miners, loggers, charcoal makers, etc., earned much, much less than tenant farmers. And that made it very hard for those men to secure wives in a society where sex-selective infanticide, plus a certain amount of concubinage, created a perpetual shortage of marriageable women. Having no dependents, conversely, allowed these men to live on a third of the not too princely income of a tenant farmer, and helps explain why the proletariat didn't grow even in a market economy. So market economies create winners and losers. In every generation, there are men falling into the proletariat. But if the last generation of proletarians had a very low reproduction rate, because so many of these men couldn't marry, then that class doesn't grow. But that's a topic for another day. For now, what I want to emphasize is that people without wives or descendants were considered dangerous men with little stake in society, reinforcing their marginality in a vicious cycle. Such men also tended to move around a lot. Mines, being generally poorly capitalized, closed rather frequently. In one good sample that we have from the southwest frontier, 60% of mines closed within 5 years of opening. Old forests were rarely cut sustainably, and even where new ones were planted sustainably, the original planters tended to sell their interests and move on after a few years. In short, non-agricultural resource extraction was associated with mobile people. Mobile people were not properly registered from the state's point of view, nor were they thought to be restrained by a community, making them even more objects of suspicion and discrimination. In short, so-called liumin, a term you could translate as drifters or perhaps vagrants, were seen as sliding downwards from having been liangmin, good subjects, perhaps having already become irredeemable. And elites using this term rarely distinguished mobile workers from unemployed mobile vagrants. Social policy aimed at preventing the emergence of such people in the first place, rather than at trying to recuperate them once they'd reached this dismal state. Inviting them into a frontier area in large numbers was simply asking for trouble. And indeed, even in a period when the state is encouraging migration to, for instance, the southwestern frontier, there are usually, on paper at least, efforts made to screen out landless single men. Doesn't work terribly well, but that's what officials are supposed to do. Now, some contrary voices were heard, especially in the 1720s and 1730s. Including one Yunnan governor who imagined a remarkably modern-sounding regional development program centered on mining. By the 1740s, though, official opinion had turned very strongly against encouraging migration to the frontiers, especially by the unemployed. After the conquest of Xinjiang was completed in 1759, there was a very brief discussion of encouraging immigration, initiated by the emperor himself. But it quickly became clear that this had very little support. For the next few decades, most non-soldiers who went to Xinjiang were actually criminals sentenced to exile. The ups and downs of southwestern policy were more complex, but there too it became quite clear quite quickly that single men were not wanted, and that those who came to do something other than farm were objects of particular suspicion. But this began to change around 1800, albeit slowly. A man named Shen Yao circulated an essay which advocated filling up Xinjiang as much as possible with impoverished immigrants from the heartland, both for the sake of holding Xinjiang and because, he said, it would give these people a chance to remake themselves into good subjects who would raise families, register for the neighborhood watch, and otherwise make themselves into desirable people. Others made similar arguments and surveyed the territory, identifying suitable spots. Writing in the 1820s, Gong Zizhen and soon others made an argument that had been barely heard since the first post-conquest debates about Xinjiang. And this was that so-called Liumin should be encouraged to move to the frontier, where both agricultural and other work, such as sedentary stock raising and mining, could make good subjects of them, while also helping the Qing finance a large security apparatus. What may be more important than Gong's specific recommendations about Xinjiang is what his general formulation erases. Because it erases the idea that the line between farming and non-farming areas represented an impassable limit of civilized society and the unified empire. Here too, of course, Gong was partly building on long-standing Qing ideology, in which it was essential that at least the Manchus, who had long been sedentary without being agricultural, had to be considered civilized. They were, after all, running the show. As other Inner Asian people were converted from allies or enemies to subjects, they were also confined to set territories. Various groups of conquered Mongols, for instance, became something like ranchers rather than nomadic herders, moving much, much less than they used to. Changes elsewhere in the empire were also eroding the idea that sedentary equaled agricultural equaled civilized. Early 19th century emperors, officials, and literati in both central and southwestern China were forced by a series of turn-of-the-century rebellions to think about how to restore peace to highland societies in particular. Mountains had been the principal stronghold of the rebels, including both ethnically Han people from the Middle Yangtze heartland, key to the White Lotus Rebellion, and so-called barbarian highlanders, key to various southwestern minority uprisings. At any rate, early Qing hopes that these remote, hard-to-rule places could simply be kept empty had clearly become impractical. Stabilizing the Southwest thus required filling the mountains with good subjects. And since those who already had farms were unlikely to move in sufficient numbers, especially to places where agriculture was dicey, one needed to stabilize mobile people. Discussing how to prevent various recently reconquered highland forest areas, which, once largely unoccupied, had become retreats for smugglers and outlaws of various sorts, trying to think about how to prevent them from becoming sites of unrest again, the official and essayist Yen Rui argued in the 1820s against trying to farm these areas, an ecologically dubious proposition anyway, since replacing trees with the immigrants' favorite cultivars, like maize and potatoes, led to rapid erosion. Instead, Yen said, these areas should be populated with loggers, miners, and paper makers, and others engaged in traditionally dangerous occupations, as long as those enterprises could be rendered sufficiently stable that the people in question would remain in one place, rather than exhausting a given site and then moving on. As long as these people stayed put, Yen argued, they could be registered by the state, they would form stable families and lineages, and one might add, be near ancestral graves, pay taxes, join community compacts, making them responsible for each other's behaviors, and even be eligible for the civil service exams. And doing those things would make them perfectly good, civilized subjects. Interestingly, Yen rarely called these people by that term liumin, the one that I translated as vagrants. He instead preferred the less pejorative term wuye, or the unemployed. Although literally speaking, liumin would have been more accurate. These people were, after all, without fixed residence. They were floating, but they weren't without occupations. He clearly saw almost all of these migrants as redeemable if they could find steady work, which need not be farming as long as it wasn't itinerant, for this would allow them to have wives and descendants. Interestingly, though, he never says where the women for this would come from. The key, as Yen saw it, was to keep these people in one place, get them to start or bring families, and then recruit these now solid subjects into neighborhood compacts, militia, and other institutions that guaranteed peace. This, he claimed, was what had turned the tide against the White Lotus Rebellion after conventional armies had failed. And this is also what various officials along the frontiers in the Southwest claimed that they were doing from the 1810s to the 1840s, when, for whatever reason, these frontiers were indeed generally peaceful. A man named Wu Qijun, Governor General of the southwestern provinces of Yunnan and Guizhou in 1844-45, went so far as to claim that when governed properly, which in his mind included providing loans of working capital, miners, loggers, etc., were actually better human material for stabilizing the frontier than were farmers, because they congregated in larger groups, making it easier to register them, enroll them in militia, and so on. It's particularly interesting that Wu and some other officials promoting this strategy saw the mine managers as the logical people to organize these community compacts and militia, and to moderate disputes within the context of those organizations. Essentially, he was delegating local government to these men with relatively little oversight. The idea of both governing and improving people through community organizations was a very old one in China, but applying it to non-agricultural frontier areas and to people previously considered inherently dangerous, and thus best not to have in large groups at all, was an important shift, one without which the post-1895 enthusiasm for frontier resource extraction as the vanguard of the nation would have been inconceivable. Gong Zizhen, similarly, argued that unemployed people from core provinces like Shandong and Zhili could move to Xinjiang, become either farmers or stock herders there, and, quote, be able to raise children and grandchildren. The idea of people from the agricultural heartland becoming pastoralists, and this being a positive change that made them better subjects and the empire more stable, would have been considered quite strange in the past. But it made sense when the land of pastoralists was no longer a land of nomads. Shortly after Gong's time, officials not only started encouraging more farmers to move to Xinjiang, as mentioned before, but began liberalizing restrictions on mining there, something that had been proposed but generally rejected in earlier decades. And by this time, there had also been some rethinking about the southeast coast, where different kinds of mobile people tied to the sea were increasingly numerous. The state was increasingly accepting of the idea that, given 18th century population growth, the southeast coast simply couldn't support all its people through agriculture, and it was trying harder than before to identify non-farmers who might nonetheless help secure the regime's borders rather than transgress them. Now, this rethinking was a limited one. The privileged ideological status of farming remained, and in the Southwest there was also actually a surge in agricultural migrants in the early 19th century. But suitability for farming was ceasing to be the sine qua non for a territory's inclusion in the civilization and polity of China, or for treating a person as a potential good subject. Some officials were also suggesting ambitious irrigation projects on northern frontiers, imagining unprecedented increases in the arable land of those regions. In erasing the idea that the limits of agriculture were also the limits of the civilized polity, these thinkers were not restoring an ancient idea of universal empire, except perhaps as a very distant utopian dream. On the contrary, as already noted, they were referring with increasing frequency to the idea of a territorial border in roughly the modern sense. This helped make the unprecedentedly large outline of the Qing, which is quite close to that of today's China, compatible with long-standing ideas of the cultural basis of that polity. While mass nationalism still lay far in the future, this rethinking allowed early and mid-19th century thinkers to associate an imagined community that traced its origins to Yao and other ancient Chinese heroes, with a territory roughly twice as large as what could even loosely be considered to have been Chinese before this period. It thus helped prepare the late Qing and the Republic to meet what Benedict Anderson has described as the challenge facing imperially sponsored official nationalisms in general. And I love this phrase from Anderson: stretching the short, tight skin of the nation over the gigantic body of the empire. It also helped make it plausible to imagine that an enlarged frontier presence might be financially sustainable, a cautious but crucial step towards the 20th century idea that frontier nation regions were in fact potential El Dorados. When that shift happened, it would go along with a further shift in thinking about the miners and other frontiersmen themselves. In the 20th century, and especially the late 20th century, they were often portrayed as the hardy vanguard of the nation, who by struggling in a harsh environment to extract resources China needed, were not only contributing economically and politically, but in some views, influenced by social Darwinism, even biologically. By moving away from the effete and over-civilized lands of China proper, they would, according to some commentators, revitalize the race. By contrast to these long-range outcomes, what the people I have focused on here took were mostly steps towards rethinking the realm. They didn't have the capacity to do the sorts of things that the People's Republic in particular would do, to actually settle a lot of these places on a mass scale. As we know, Geng Zejun and others were writing about the importance of tightening control of the Far West on the eve of a century in which the empire and its successors would have tremendous difficulty just fending off a variety of internal rebels and foreign powers. But those pressures made the appearance of new rationales for holding on to territories to which elites had had very little attachment just a few decades before, an even more significant development. Without those changes, one can either easily imagine either a Qing withdrawal from these areas amidst the tumult of the 19th century, or a situation in which the new, often racialized Han Chinese nationalism of the early 20th century might have walked away from various non-Han parts of the Manchu Imperium, thinking of them as more trouble than it's worth. Instead, of course, what happened was the opposite, that even amidst all sorts of troubles in China proper, the late Qing and their successors doubled down on holding these places. Thank you.
Thank Professor Pomeranz for extremely rich and I would say very dense the talk. And I think we're running out of time a little bit, but we have maybe 5 minutes for a few questions. So let's keep our questions short.
Very insightful talk. I really enjoyed this. You were mentioning that the migration and the population migration to Xinjiang, like that was kind of a progress that the Qing dynasty actually realized that was the end of its rule. But even during that time, there was some debate about in the central government about whether to give up Xinjiang as a whole or actually try to reinforce it, right? Because I remember there was a period of time where Xinjiang was to become an independent country, and the central government actually went to conquer that part, and also they had some struggle with Russia during that process. So during that part, kind of period, there was a debate about whether to actually spend the money to actually reconquer Xinjiang, or actually strengthen the coastal areas and especially the navy, and that was constantly a struggle, in the central government. Do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, the key moment is 1876, 77, when you have simultaneously this large Muslim rebellion in the Northwest and threats along the coast, particularly from the French, who are casting longing eyes at Taiwan, and the biggest famine in at least 150 years. And the Qing at this point have very limited borrowing capacity. And the question is, what are you going to borrow for? And you're absolutely right. There was a three-sided debate between famine relief, coastal defense, and reconquering Xinjiang. But reconquering Xinjiang wins out, which would have been far from a foregone conclusion had those same things happened a few decades earlier. So yeah, it's certainly true that there's a lively debate, and the views that I'm describing as ascendant were not unanimous, but they were ascendant, and a few decades earlier they hadn't been.
So do you think the instability in Xinjiang right now, like in current China, has anything to do with how it was developed during Qing Dynasty?
It has a little bit to do with it, but I think actually not that much. What I would say is that a pattern does develop to some extent in the late Qing, but even more in the Republic and the People's Republic, of settling Xinjiang by creating essentially isolated colonies of Han Chinese immigrants clustered around particular concentrations of resources. So either around oases where you can actually farm, or around mines, or in the, starting in the 40s and then on into the PRC, around oil wells. And so if you look at Xinjiang today, the population is roughly half Han Chinese, but it's this checkerboard of places that are 90% Han Chinese, and then another place that's almost 0% Han Chinese. And not surprisingly, that kind of situation leads to a lot of tension, particularly because the Han Chinese settlements, being clustered around the resource concentrations, are much, much richer. If you look at the Southwest, and obviously this is not the only difference between Northwest and Southwest, but in the Southwest, you've had far more of the migration consisted of families going without state sponsorship, settling wherever they settled, or in many cases single men going, intermarrying with local women, etc. And you don't have very many of these clusters where suddenly in the midst of an area that's 50-50 overall, it's 90% one group or 90% the other. You have a lot more integration, and while that has not been conflict-free either, certainly today, it's a much more peaceful situation. I mean, Yunnan doesn't have anything like the unrest that Xinjiang does. I mean, I'm giving an overly simplified description of the difference, but I do think that's one part of it. And to some extent, maybe you can trace that back to this late Qing idea of, oh yeah, let's settle this place, and let's settle it by isolating particular clusters of resources where we can settle a bunch of people all at once, and they can then provide income that we can then tap to pay for the defense of the region.
Going to ask about language and religion and how those two factors factored into what you talked about.
So it's a huge story, and of course it's different in different places. One of the things that's interesting about both Southwest and Northwest, from the point of view of the story I was telling today, is that both have very significant Muslim populations. And the Qing had a real problem dealing with Islam, in part because the Qing way of dealing with religion was basically to position the emperor as a patron of that religion without having to be a member of it. This works just fine for instance, Tibetan Buddhism, where there's a well-known role for the non-Buddhist who is nonetheless a patron of Buddhism. Islam doesn't really have a place for the non-Islamic patron, and that's part of the problem. There are also a series of other issues. How in a short compass to deal with this. But one of the things that really is striking about the Southwest, so there are Muslim uprisings in both the Southwest and the Northwest in the 1860s and 70s, both of which essentially end in bloodbaths. One of the interesting things is that in the Southwest, once the bloodbath is over, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of religious tension afterwards. And in fact, interestingly, if you then read both Qing and Republican stuff about the Southwest frontier, they switch from thinking about the Muslims to focusing on other minority groups, groups like the Miao, etc. In the Northwest, that doesn't happen. The religious dimension remains a problem, down to the present day. There are a whole lot of reasons for that. Some of it does in fact have to do with language, since the Muslims of the Southwest are mostly Chinese speaking. The Muslims of the Northwest are largely speak various Turkic languages. But there are a whole bunch of other things going on as well. I think this would turn into a very, very long answer if I...
Obviously, we have to welcome Professor Pomeranz to come back for the other answers.